So before I talk about Son of Saul, which for those of you who may not have seen it, is a remarkable story um, called a documentary Fable, and we'll get to that, about a Sonderkommando, the Jews who were employed by the Nazis into camps to help within the crematorium. And when he sees a child that had miraculously survived the gas chamber only to die a little later, he presumes that it's his son, which we never find out whether or not it is, and it probably isn't. And the rest of the film tracks his desperate search to find a rabbi to provide a proper burial, that is to say the Kaddish, for this child. And so the film, as I'm going to present it, opens up a new chapter in Holocaust representation, and it speaks particularly to the claims and the edicts that were established by Claude Lounsman's 1985 9-hour documentary, Shoah. So as you have on the screen above or in front of you is a basic idea of what I want to go through from Shoah. Then I want to speak a little bit about the films that followed Shoah and how they exemplify the problems that the earlier film indicated. And I'll speak a little bit about a film unfinished, because that's also, I think, a part of this new generation of Holocaust representations that speak to the Shoah. And finally, then we'll get to Son of Saul. I hope we get time to speak about the Kaddish and the peculiarity of the prayer itself, and of course, what it means to want to say a prayer for the dead when you are, as the protagonist already describes himself, as already dead. So the problem for Lanzmann is that the Holocaust defies representation. It has too many loose ends, too many open questions, too many distortions. The whole scope of it defies the possibility of representation in the modes we have come to recognize or document events. The quote from Sartre, I think, is a good indication of what the problem is. We have come to the image with the idea of synthesis. The image is an act, not a thing. A thing is how usually it's presented, as a mirroring or an illustration, and not part of the image too often is the so-called editorial work that goes into producing an image with its clean-cut edges, so to speak, and it seems to be a composite whole. Well, even if we begin to think about how do you talk about the beginning of the Holocaust and how do you talk about the end of the Holocaust, we can easily imagine how it's impossible to think for a moment that the Holocaust can be contained within the parameters of a strict linear narrative, that is to say, something with a clean beginning, middle, and end. Schindler's List, for example. The reason, of course, if I were to ask you, when did the Holocaust begin? Well, you could say maybe with the Weimar Republic, maybe you want to say with 1933, or would it be wrong to say that it begins in the era of German Romanticism with the rebirth of a folkish consciousness and the Hep riots of 1870? Or if we're talking about anti-Semitism in general and Jew hatred, maybe 1492, or you could go all the way back even to 70 AD. And likewise, going forward, we understand from third generation narratives now that there is no end to the trauma. And neuroscientists are also discovering, right, there are genetic markers that suggest the traumatic experience are passed down. So what Shoah does, if you haven't seen it, it's a very stark film, no archival footage, no documentary footage, no photographs, no props to help thousands, it seems, of witnesses to recall what they witnessed. So the issue right away is, what is the status of witness testimony? Because in the end, that's all we have besides the documents, and the documents need the testimony, of course, to contextualize those images. Well, the problem we know from Prevot Levy, for example, in The Drowned and the Saved, is for victims of trauma, the events don't congeal into a narrative that can be explained very easily, and certainly not in a linear manner. That is to say, that because so much is out of focus and you are still controlled by the events and haven't established psychic mastery to come to narrate them, the issue becomes that you start to fill in the details to try and gain some purchase on the events from stuff you've heard, or maybe you saw in a movie, or something that happened later. And so your testimony is always a bit adulterated. The facts remain. The facts are indisputable. The Holocaust happened, these people died, the camps are there, but the manner in which we contextualize them does change. And the image is the same thing. In a way, it's another edict on graven images that don't excuse themselves or somehow thematize that they are already a construction, that a frame and a camera has already edited, cropped, and produced what seems to be a synthetic image, but necessarily covers up loose ends, etc. Let me just give you a few examples from the film itself. If any of you have seen it, you'll recognize that there was an interview with the gentleman who was in charge of scheduling the trains to Auschwitz. And the interviewer doesn't give any, asks very direct questions, doesn't editorializes, and shows no emotion. He wants the pure testimony. The testimony, of course, is the guy says, I had no idea. Now, how is that possible? How is it suddenly that every day there are all these trains, or a few trains, special trains, every week, all the time, going to Auschwitz? Did he think that Auschwitz had suddenly become a 24/7 tourist attraction with water parks, etc.? But he insists that he had no idea. Now, for the viewer, how do you evaluate that testimony? A, is he just flat out lying? B, is it possible he couldn't have known? Willful ignorance? Or did willful ignorance allow him to forget his part? And finally, well, all of those possibilities you can see are in play, and they create more questions rather than answering them. Likewise, we see a pair of survivors from Corfu, and they are asked, do they think that anti-Semitism still exists today in Corfu? Both of them shrug it off. But how do we know? Are they saying that because the camera's there? Are they saying that because they don't want to feel, they don't want to invoke the wrath, so to speak, of their fellow citizens? Or is it actually how they feel? So where are we left? What we're left with is a film that has so many unanswerable questions that that thundering vacuum of emptiness at the center of the film testifies to the magnitude, the unrepresentable magnitude of the Holocaust. Now, if I will, I'll just say a moment about Schindler's List, because Schindler's List is sometimes put forth as Hollywood's canonical treatment of the Holocaust. As you know, it was so remarkably celebrated. But the film itself, right, is really about Schindler, and the whole story of the Holocaust has to be cleanly told and tracked to the moral redemption of Schindler. That is, right, the story of the Holocaust is fitted so that it follows and supports the trajectory of Schindler's moral redemption. The problems that result can be even factual. For example, from what I read, Schindler was actually in jail and wasn't present when the list was drawn up. Does that make a difference? Two, is there's a famous scene, or a very dramatic scene, when mistakenly the women he's trying to save are taken to Auschwitz. And at the last moment, when they're in the showers, undressed, and the gas is supposed to come on, the water pours down. Typical Hollywood drama. But of course, while there were showers in Auschwitz, the gas chambers had no showers. They weren't equipped for water. That's an entirely impossible scene that would play into the hands of the people who want to dispute some of the factual basis of the Holocaust. And finally, I think you understand that the movie really is through the perspective of Schindler. The Jews are a supporting cast in their own tragedy, when in one of the final scenes, you see him standing above them all, and there they are with their adulation, which of course is due, that what he did shouldn't be downplayed. For sake of brevity, let me jump to Son of Saul, and let me show these 4 photographs that form the basis of these. These 4 photographs, these are the only photographs that document what happened near the gas chambers at Auschwitz. They form a central scene in the central part of the film, and you see the danger that the photographer and his helper had, as well as the difficulty of getting those films and even getting them out. Now, Didi Huberman, the French art historian turned Holocaust historian, wrote a book, 4 photographs from Auschwitz about these, and he called it Images in Spite of All. And so when he saw Son of Saul, he immediately took up the position that I do, that the film with these photographs did something that responds successfully to what Lanzmann had said. First of all, the images are more like a montage. They don't attempt to tell a whole story, but still, they have documentary value as well. They are both sign or a document as well as an act. And not to address them would be a way of ignoring history, ignoring the Holocaust. But more important, I think, is what you see in these photographs is, while they form the basis of a story, the story that is told also takes note of the failures of, say, a Schindler's List, and works to undo the possibility of one story providing a master narrative or a perspective that could be all-inclusive. So I'd like you to take a moment now and look at this 3-minute clip of the opening scene, and it's narrated by the director, Laszlo Nemes.
We're singing in the trees, and we arrive directly into the middle of a space that is undefined. And we wanted to establish immediately the visual approach of the film. And it starts with a blurred image, and the viewer has to make something out of it, and people usually are a little caught off guard and don't understand why the focus is not put. But then we establish that this film is going to be a close-up, basically a portrait of one man. And so in this sequence we really wanted to establish that immediately in a very simple manner. The camera is handheld, and we planned basically all the positions, the camera positions and movement of the main actor and background action. But as everything is moving, it introduces a sort of chaos into the scene. This idea that it's unpredictable, and that you are in a space, you're in a place that is very well known to the public, but at the same time we believed it's never been shown the way it was, you know, having this chaos and organization at the same time, this frenzy, the voices, the languages, the lack of information. So everything about that and the fact that much is left to the viewer and their imagination. These things are put in place in the very first moments of the film. We never really say where we are, but we give enough information for the viewer to infer that this is a concentration camp. And we didn't want to use the usual signals, the signs, the obligatory, Nazi flags or saluting officers. We really wanted to immerse the viewer in the situation without giving these obligatory signs. So it's a chunk of reality that we wanted to have, and obviously you catch things in the background, but basically we wanted to introduce the character who has to do what he has to do, being part of the Sonderkommando section, the special prisoners group that are forced to assist the Nazis in the extermination. And we see that this man is now almost a robot. He has no feelings.
So, what I think it's important to gather from that clip is while we will follow this character from here to the end, and it has the outward appearance of a three-part Hollywood narrative, it's completely impossible to establish any anchored perspective for long. The close-up, either it's on him or it's on his shoulder, the camera, so that you can never orient yourself. You have no idea exactly what's going on more than what's visible by the protagonist. And so there's no attempt to have a master narrative. The voice and perspective from above could never be taken in, and it's not taken in here. And I think there's a slide that follows here, and you will see that what he wanted to say, there are no survivors in my film. I have only the dead. And it becomes clear, right? Unlike Schindler's List, he understood that the story of the Holocaust was one about those who died, and those of the survivors, however wonderful and grateful and we are for them, that doesn't really tell the story of the Holocaust. But I think in concluding, what I want to do is tell you how this film does something else and leave it a bit open-ended. And I said at the beginning, it's a documentary fable, in itself an oxymoron. How can a documentary be a fable? Well, of course, the story that is constructed around these four documentary images is a fable. He sees a child that he thinks is his own and wants the Kaddish to be said. He wants a proper burial in a place where proper burials are unheard of. And so what he's doing in this story is he's giving us an idea or a fable about an experience that no film and nobody could ever tell. The one experience missing from all Holocaust survivor tales or documentary tales is really, what was it like to be the living dead? What was it like to be one of the so-called Muslims who just wasted away? That experience is impossible to know, but this is one of the first stories, or maybe the first one, that tries to contemplate that by thinking, what would death look like? And what possibility could one have for some sign of hope in a situation that's absolutely hopeless? And I think the great irony there, is that the protagonist has already declared himself and his fellow prisoners, we are already dead. So the already dead who have died a godless death still seek to say the Kaddish. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because I'm a little over here. But what's curious you'll see is that there's no mention of death in the mourner's Kaddish. It's all about God and his glory. The purpose, I suspect, and I've been told, is that death should not have final dominion over one's being and one's thoughts. And the mourner should recognize that superior to death is God and his glory. And so when would that kind of faith be most put to the test? It would certainly be by these Muslims, which of course the root should not be confused. Even though it's Muslim, nobody's ever been really known what the root of that word is. But we should understand, though, that the Muslims, right, this attempt to say the Kaddish for those Jews who were already dead, destined to die not as Jews, but in some fashion to recover that in this fashion. And let me leave it at that. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. And I got somewhere not too long. So, right, we move to questions now, is that correct?
That's right. Thank you so much. And a reminder for all of our students, especially that this content is part of a course Richard will be offering in the fall. It's popular film and the Holocaust. There was one request to show the photos again, and I
Sure.
just wondered if you wanted to give any more commentary on these 4 photos.
You can see in the film, at least, right, which tries to explain the circumstances or document the circumstances they're taken. They're in a sort of storage closet, and the photographer has to take the images with the camera behind his back. He can't be looking out, right, because it would be suspicious. So these photographs you can see are, hardly of a remarkable quality, but they're remarkable because they are the only documentary evidence we have of what's going on right near the crematorium. But their genesis is, of course, and I think too, Didi Huaren points out, unlike the images that you so often see in more typical Hollywood narratives, these are acts insofar as it's a montage. You would really have to be conscious of trying to put these pieces together and end up with a puzzle that's, of course, incomplete. Okay, does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one more, what is the Musulman? Can you explain a
Oh,
little?
I'm sorry. Okay, the Musulman actually means Muslim, but don't let that distract you, though it's hard not to. These are the people who just wasted away to nothing. So, right, the most of the people in the camps, as we know, and from the photographs, even when they were liberated, the people wasted away to nothing. I mean, they had nothing to eat. You'll hear survivors say, once a day we got turnip soup. And if you didn't get it near the bottom, all you got was, very limited broth. And you're working these ridiculous hours in incredible cold with nothing on. Of course, you're not going to survive long. Primo Levi writes in the beginning of The Drowned and the Saved that he was fortunate enough to have been sent to Auschwitz, I think he says in the summer of 44. And what he means by that, of course, it was late enough. It turned out to be late enough that it was survivable. But so what they were is they were very hunched over. And so some people thought maybe they were called Muslimer because they look a bit like the Muslims when they pray. But that's been dismissed and nobody really knows the source. Okay? Does that help?
Yes, definitely. And I think that we are actually at time. So do you have any other closing comments you'd like to leave us with?
No, I think though, I can't emphasize enough, and I didn't do a good enough job with it, is the curiosity of the fable that surrounds these. What does it mean to want to say the mourner's Kaddish for a child who probably isn't your own in a situation where you're already consider yourself already dead? And I think it opens up to a lot of interesting questions. But other than that, no, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it was worthwhile. And thank you to Sarah and Emily.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks to everyone for coming. As I mentioned, this was the end of our Quick Talk series. We do invite you on May 21st to a Stroum Lectures presentation. You can register at jewishstudies.washington.edu, and a reminder about the university's counseling services, which are online, letstalk.uw.edu. Thanks so much.